Should you buy a PS1 in 2018? Originally released in 1994 in Japan and 1995 in most of the rest of the world, this is a console that put Sony on the map. Originally planned as a disc-based add-on for the Super Nintendo, after relations with Nintendo went sour and we were graced with Zelda on the CDI, Sony decided to set off on their own in a fury, set to make a console of their own that would kick Nintendo's ass. For that initial console generation when the PS1 came out, it did. This thing sold phenomenally well, undercutting the Sega Saturn, having disc-based games that could hold way more than the cartridges used by the N64, and having honestly a really nice gray design. It's no wonder why the PS1 sold as well as it did and is considered an absolutely classic console. But the real question is it worth owning nowadays? Well, that's what we're gonna answer in today's video. Welcome to Stuff We Play, where I love everything that's weird and retro, even if you might not actually need it nowadays. And if that sounds cool to you, why not subscribe? So jumping into the hardware, yeah, this is the PS1. This is the PlayStation 1. There's a lot of different variations of this one model. A lot of them have ports removed and added and whatnot. The original model actually had RCA ports in the back. There's a serial expansion port. There's a weird expansion port that for some reason you could put an unofficial Game Boy player type thing into. But what was also weird at the time is this thing didn't use cartridges. It used discs. And, oh man, that's such a pleasing button to press. This is the Sony PlayStation 1. An absolutely phenomenal console, but also a little different than most PlayStations that came after. For example, just look at this original controller. Notice something that's missing? Joysticks. Before we had the DualShock, we just had the PS1 controller, which was pretty much just a SNES controller, but with these little feet grip things, and also an extra set of shoulder buttons. However, this was followed a few years later by the Sony analog controller. Yeah, not the DualShock, the analog controller. Before we were finally given, yes, the original DualShock. What's pretty interesting though is you see this connector used by the PS1. You can actually use all controllers and accessories made for the PS1 that use this connector on the PlayStation 2. But the honest truth as well is that this isn't the absolute best version of the PS1. I mean, there are probably better ways to play PS1 games as well, but we aren't at that point yet. But what's interesting is, also unlike cartridge-based games, you can't save directly to a disc, so these came with memory cards. These are cheap and easy to find, but do keep in mind if you're playing a PS1 disc on a PS2, you still need to use a PS1 memory card. But what I think is the absolute best version of the PS1 is this, which is the PS1, with it actually spelled out, PS1. It came out right around the same time as the PS2, but cool enough, had this flip-top screen. It's not completely portable, I mean, unless you bought a third-party external battery pack, you still had to plug it into a wall, but it had the portability factor of like a laptop without a battery, which means it's still completely impractical to own today, but I absolutely love this thing. Besides, it's a nice CRT screen on there, and there's no better way to play Mega Man X5 than one of these, or at least that's as far as I'm concerned, right? So that's cool and all. The PS1's had some cool revisions and whatnot. It's interesting when it came out. But what are the games like, and why are the games so revered nowadays? Why are we seeing so many throwbacks of PS1 games nowadays? What are the games that are inspiring these throwbacks? Well, that's what we're about to get into. So the PS1 had some fantastic games. A lot of great ones. We saw the start of series such as Gran Turismo. GT1, 2 are phenomenal games back in the day, and while they haven't aged the best, they're still solid racers for the time. But what's even better than that is Moto2 Racing, which was actually made by the same guy, but like before them. It's a more cartoonish racer that's also really good. And staying on the topic of racers, Crash Team Racing. It's so good, it's like Mario Kart, but with Crash Bandicoot. But speaking of which, let's go into some platformers, the Crash Bandicoot games. Now, I'm very new to these, but these are so classic. They're a ton of fun here, and yeah, they don't look pretty. PS1 3D is honestly really ugly. But Crash 1, 2, and especially 3 play phenomenally well. Now, admittedly, these games are probably best experienced via the Crash Insane trilogy, which actually remade these and is out on the PS4 and on Nintendo Switch. But they are still solid on the PS1. There are other great platformers as well though. The Spyro games, Croc Legend of the Gobos, Gex, which, okay, hasn't aged the best, but I enjoyed Gex. That was a fun 2D platformer. And funny thing about that, there were not a lot of 2D platformers on the PS1. Sony was really making a big push towards 3D. You know, that was the next big thing at the time. But someone who was actually really good with 2D stuff then was Capcom. Capcom gave us Mega Man 8, the one and only 32-bit styled Mega Man classic game. While the cutscenes are laughably bad, the gameplay is extremely solid, and it's a bit easier than your average Mega Man game, meaning that it's a great place for beginners to start the series. However, what really shone here are the Mega Man X games, mainly Mega Man X4 and X5. Yes, there was also Mega Man X6, but I like to act like that one doesn't exist. These games are honestly really solid adventures, X4 especially, but X5 is great as well. Fun fact about Mega Man X5, by the way, this was originally going to be the last game in the Mega Man X series, and then they made Mega Man X6 anyways because it was selling well. X4 also has a laughably bad cutscenes, but it also has Zero, and his first completely playable experience without any frills. Seriously, whether you play as X or Zero, and I prefer Zero because he's so up close and personal and he has a sword and the long hair and he's so cool, it's a blast. It's a great game. Mega Man X4 is probably one of the best platformers of all time. It's at the very least in my top 20. But of course there are more than just platformers. They had RPGs. The original Persona game, Chrono Cross, Final Fantasy, oh my god, Final Fantasy. We had ports of all the games from 1 through 6, except for 3 for some reason. And we also had Final Fantasy VII, the game that made RPGs popular in the West. I could go on about this one for hours, but let's be honest, it's Final Fantasy VII. This is pretty much the gold standard for RPGs, even though I like Final Fantasy 8 and 9 more. By the way, Final Fantasy 8 and 9, great games. Final Fantasy 8 gets a lot of hate, and honestly, it does some weird things. What's the hell of drawing magic, y'all? But it's still a great time. And Final Fantasy 9 goes back to more of the fantasy-inspired roots of, well, Final Fantasy, instead of more of the futuristic-esque thing that was done in 7 and 8. There was also Final Fantasy Tactics, a game that admittedly when I played back in the day, I couldn't get into it. But I'm giving it another try, and I gotta say, this is great. It's so fun. It's so good. I love me some Final Fantasy Tactics. I mean, I could talk about more PS1 games for hours. Rayman, Jumping Flash, Alundra, Crash Bash. Okay, maybe not so much Crash Bash, though it is, I guess, the closest thing to Mario Party we had here. And yeah, the Spyro games, but I've never played Spyro. But if you want to learn all about Spyro, my buddy Jordan Fringe has a channel that talks a lot about Spyro. It's good stuff. But moving on, I have a controversial opinion on the PS1. It's a great system, but the best way to play PS1 games is not on original hardware. Okay, so many of you are probably saying, emulation! You know what? No, that's not technically what I'm going with this. If you're screaming at me in the comments about emulators right now, go away, please. But you see, the PS1, of course it can play PS1 games, but the PS2 could also play PS1 games. But as we established in my PS2 buying guide, some of those have issues. But as we also established in my PlayStation 3 buying guide, while only the first model of the PlayStation 3 could play PlayStation 2 games off the disc, every single model of the PlayStation 3 ever made can play like 95% of all the PlayStation 1 games ever made. Doesn't matter if you have a launch model or even the recently released, as of, a few years ago, super slim model, it can play PS1 games off the discs, and it even upscales them. In addition to that though, you can buy PS1 games as PS1 classics off the PlayStation Network store. And not only can you buy them like that on the PS3, but you can also buy them on the PSP and the PlayStation Vita. I should also mention that the PSP can natively run PlayStation 1 ISOs, but do with that info as you wish. So ideally, though the PS1 is great, and my personal favorite way to play PS1 games is using the PlayStation 1 Slim revision with the flip-top screen just because of how cool that is. I mean, it looks so cool. Real best way to play PS1 games will really be download from PSN or otherwise. Yeah, I know modding exists. You don't have to tell me. Or off the actual discs, because yes, the discs do work. The best way to play them is on a PS3. And even though it's definitely not the prettiest PS3, I still stand by what I said in my PS3 guide. The best model thus to get to play PS1 games is the PlayStation 3 Super Slim, because it's still fairly cheap, and along with being able to play PlayStation 1 games, you can play all those fantastic PlayStation 3 games. But you know what? I may be beginning to ramble on just a bit. What memories do you have of the PlayStation 1? Let me know down in the comment section below. And while we're at, why don't you subscribe to Stuff We Play for more great content like this. And if you want to watch more buying guides, why not check out one of my weirder ones, such as this one I did on the Bandai WonderSwan. Do you have any idea what that console is? If you don't, or even if you do, check out that guide. Thank you very much for watching. If you feel so inclined, why not back us on Patreon, because every dollar earned from Patreon does go back into the channel itself. Stay classy, and I'll see you next time.